What did the Enlightenment promise us? It promised us freedom on the basis of being able to think for ourselves and thus govern ourselves. That was really the premise. That if we were released from constraints of myth and tradition, released to be able to think and reason and discover what was true for ourselves, that was the source of our freedom. But something happened at the end of the 20th century, which was this new way of thinking about society and human beings as a market. What does it mean to rule yourself if we are all meant to think of ourselves as commodities and everything is marketized? What's really tragic about the economization of every aspect of life is that we're really seeing the Enlightenment dream come to a kind of end, where the mandates of a financialized society all but extinguish the real freedom to make yourself according to your own lights.
In the early 2000s, we made a film, The Corporation. We argued that large, publicly traded corporations are programmed relentlessly to pursue profit and growth and have become the dominant institutions of our time. We showed that the corporation is deemed by law to be a person, that it has the same rights as human beings, sometimes even more. So we posed the question, if the corporation is legally a person, what kind of person is it? We analyzed it the way a psychiatrist would analyze a patient. We found his character to be pathologically self-interested. Now, with the world in crisis, climate change, spiraling inequality, a global pandemic, we re-examine the corporation, how it's changed, how it's changing our world, and how it's changing our very sense of who we are. To begin this story, we take you back to the 2000s. At that time, the corporation was in crisis.
This meeting will come to order. This is a case of America's largest corporate bankruptcy.
Enron and WorldCom had collapsed in corporate scandals of unprecedented magnitude. Corporations were being called out for malfeasance that was destroying lives and the environment. Around the same time, globalization was sparking worldwide protests against the growing power and impunity of the corporation. And our first film had just charged that corporations are institutional psychopaths.
I think calling corporations psychopaths absolutely had an impact, and I can say that for myself. When I had to consume that particular thought, that was interesting, to use a very soft word. It was outrageous. Has it influenced it? Yes. Are we on the road to recovery? I hope we are.
About 2005, we started to see many of the world's biggest branded companies suddenly making very sweeping promises. Promises such as 100% carbon neutrality, zero waste to landfill, zero deforestation, 100% recycling, a real and significant shift.
Since that shift, corporations have mounted a major charm offensive, rebranding themselves and rebranding the entire capitalist system as having changed, having evolved into something new and improved.
I think there is genuinely a different dialogue that's taking place about corporations and the role that they play in society. That cult of shareholder value has seen its day as the narrow construct for how companies operate in society.
Wait, what did he say?
That cult of shareholder value has seen its day as the narrow construct for how companies operate in society.
This idea that making money for shareholders is no longer the corporation's only goal, it's the essence of the new story, the story that corporations now tell about themselves.
What is the purpose of a company? Is it just to make money?
This is Klaus Schwab, the man who first came up with the idea of a new kind of corporation.
Companies recognize that they have a special responsibility how we combine or how we blend money making and social responsibility.
To advance his ideas, Schwab built the world's most important annual gathering of corporate titans and world leaders.
Every year, Davos in Switzerland hosts one of the most important gatherings of the global super elite. It's kind of the first stop in the elite's yearly migration route. People who are successful and make a lot of money are a dime a dozen, but these are the people who are the most successful.
Davos isn't only a meeting place for the super elite. It's also where corporate chiefs and government leaders come together each year to promote the story of the new corporation. That corporations are conscientious now, no longer greedy and selfish, but poised to help make the world a better place. Sandra Navidi is a Davos insider and author of a book about the world's most powerful players.
These financial elites have great power, and in some instances, this power actually exceeds those of democratically elected people or institutions.
This is Jamie Dimon. He heads the biggest bank in the United States and is a leading voice for corporate America.
So the Jamie Dimon reception, there will be some introduction to the clients, right?
This is Sanjay Jain, one of Dimon's top executives at JP Morgan Chase. He's advising a prospective client.
No, but I knew that we needed to be here because Davos is the place where all these people come together for a week. It's insane what happens here.
And here's the client, Bebop Gresta.
Hi, Bebop Gresta, very nice to meet you.
He's looking for investors in his company that's developing a transportation capsule that travels at the speed of sound.
Sorry. Oh, God. Sorry, excuse me. Hi, this is Bebop Gresta, chairman of Hyperloop.
Oh, good. Yeah, I saw some of your colleagues. Thank you. Good luck to you.
In 2009, when the financial crisis happened, JP Morgan and Jamie Dimon in particular picked Detroit as the one city in the entire country we were going to save. Okay, so you need to say to Jamie, I just want you to know that we are building a Hyperloop to Detroit. We care about Detroit as much as you do. That's it.
Okay.
Okay, got it?
Got it.
Script?
Got it.
These guys will...
How are you? Jamie, thank you for inviting me.
Are you going like to a black tie tonight?
Well, yeah, they
You
said...
just dressed like this.
No, I wasn't
And
there.
I was telling Tony Blair,
How are you doing? Nice to meet
you guys have something in common.
Yes.
We're in a rock band.
Right.
He had his own rock band before he's prime minister.
That's true, that's true. I don't know what I was expecting from a person like Jamie Dimon. I discovered a person that installed a very great culture inside their company. They're starting programs trying to improve society. creating a special program for Detroit, reconstructing completely. I wasn't expecting that. I know what you've done for Detroit and all the effort that you need to save it. And it's not public yet, but we signed a deal with Ohio to actually build an hyperloop to Detroit. You know, we are trying to contribute. Following your example, I think it's a very important project. It's a big year for us. It's exciting.
I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Davos is a place of interaction, of dialogue. We look at the ecosystem of what's happening, but always with a sense of responsibility for us, and us, it means not just one country, not just one person. I think at the end, we are all a globally interdependent humankind.
So here in Davos, we debated the motion, is the business of business still just business? And interestingly, more than 80% said no. In today's transformative age, business has a wider accountability and opportunity.
We're in a new age of doing business. You need to give back. You need to be part of the solution. Society is demanding that companies, both public and private, serve a social purpose.
There is a new possibility. We can imagine something different. It takes courageous leadership, and it takes people who get it here, and who get it here, and who understand that life is short and precious, and if we're in positions of power and influence, that we should use that to help shift the paradigm and the possibility of what it means to be a business on the planet and what it means to be a human being.
It all sounds so good, this talk of a new kind of corporation. In Davos and everywhere else.
For many businesses, the commitment to the triple bottom line of people, profit, and planet is real. The problem is, the capitalist system as a whole is not committed to that.
There are CEOs and corporate boards attempting to do good in the world. There clearly are. But the notion that there's anything inherently socially responsible about a corporation is a counterintuitive proposition. By law, the corporation exists for one reason, to return benefits to shareholders.
There is no such thing as corporate social responsibility. Corporations don't have the leeway to sacrifice shareholder returns for doing whatever they want or whatever they believe is socially responsible.
What then do we make of the corporation's new image? Of the claim corporations have changed? Since our last film, the American Psychiatric Association has added a new item to its diagnostic checklist.
You always have to come back as a leader to purpose. Why are we here? Why are we doing business? And we want to do business for the long term. Values are part of the purpose of a company.
John Brown is a leading voice in today's new corporation movement. When he was CEO of the world's second largest oil company, he professed deep environmental beliefs while achieving record profits and meteoric growth.
You basically, for the first time, an oil company executive stepped forward to say, global warming is a problem. It set BP apart.
I think people are much more convinced now, at least around the world, that there is a real case to take precautionary action to avoid carbon concentrations going to beyond a critical level in the atmosphere.
My sense is that John Brown's concerns are genuine. His interest in the environment is genuine. His concern for workers and for people's safety, theoretically, is genuine. But those desires are just inherently conflicting with the need to make money, because turning a profit for those corporations is always going to come first.
I need an ambulance at EMT, dress down. There's people trapped in the trailer. They need help.
In 2005, when I was CEO of BP, we had a terrible tragedy. 15 people died in a refinery explosion in Texas City.
This is the second time people have died at this plant in less than a year. In that time, it has been fined for more than 14 safety violations.
All of us at BP are very deeply saddened by the loss of life and injury suffered by so many people.
After Texas City, we were at pains to say safety must never be compromised for financial performance. We were very concerned to make sure that safety, operational safety, process safety, took primacy.
It's ridiculous for John Brown to suggest that he had adequately addressed process safety in the wake of the Texas City refinery. It was less than a year later, his company had a spill in Alaska on oil pipelines, which it turns out were not maintained.
Technicians at Prudhoe Bay warned it was understaffed, lacking in routine maintenance, leak-prone, and vulnerable to...
There was a specific decision to save money by not running corrosion tests in those pipelines. It's the same kind of thing that led to the Texas City explosion.
Yet BP claimed it had learned its lesson from Texas City.
In 2007, I left BP, and I thought, this is great, this company has got it. What was so depressing to me was that, yet again, people died. And while I wasn't there and I didn't know what had happened, I could see some terrible echoes of history.
While John Brown had left BP, some things hadn't changed.
The poor decisions that led to the Deepwater Horizon echo and track what John Brown instituted in the company a decade or two before. John Brown pushed the largest cost cut that I've heard of at any corporation in any kind of industry, not just the oil industry. You can't do that without cutting corners on maintenance of equipment, without pushing timetables. And that's the culture that he built. When given that choice between doing good and doing well for your company, the fact that publicly held companies have an obligation to deliver to their shareholders, making those profits will always be the highest priority. Those trend lines are just headed in opposite directions, and I think they always will be.
We are just to make it clear, a for-profit institution, and we are making an investment in Detroit.
Remember Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan Chase? He's the CEO who wants to save Detroit. Detroit was devastated by the 2008 financial crisis. A third of its homes were abandoned. Over the next 5 years, it spiraled towards rock bottom.
When the 2008 financial crisis hammered North America, long-suffering Detroit was hit especially hard.
Detroit is officially the largest city in history to file for bankruptcy.
After bankruptcy, Jamie Dimon and his bank stepped in with vast amounts of capital.
Why Detroit?
So obviously it's good for the bank, but it's part of humanity, trying to help your city and your people come back and recover from what had been basically a terrible 20 years.
Jamie Dimon wants to rescue Detroit, but what's misleading is he wants America to believe that he and, by implication, JP Morgan Chase Bank, are somehow the good guys, that they are leading us in the direction we ought to be going in, without any memory that he and the bank caused, in part, a huge recession that wrecked the lives of millions, tens of millions of people.
At one point, the market fell as if down a well.
The NASDAQ, everything and more has been completely wiped out.
3 of the 5 biggest independent firms on Wall Street have now disappeared.
Major sectors of America's financial system are at risk of shutting down.
The 2008 financial crisis was the result of corporate misconduct and reckless speculation. That malfeasance nearly destroyed the global economy.
It cost the American economy about $20 trillion in terms of lost housing value, lost productivity from the recession. Millions of people lost their jobs. Millions of others were thrown out of their homes. People were really hurt.
The nation's biggest bank, J.P. Morgan Chase, has agreed to a $13 billion settlement with the U.S. government for misleading investors and mortgage agencies about the safety of mortgage-backed securities it sold ahead of the financial crisis. That would be the largest fine ever paid by a single bank to settle civil charges, yet doesn't even resolve a possible criminal case.
But J.P. Morgan Chase's caring image helped mask its self-interested nature.
I think we have to acknowledge that as a kind of private sector propaganda, it has been remarkably successful.
This is Anand Girdadas, an expert on how corporate elites cloak profit-making in virtue.
When you have someone like Jamie Dimon, who is running an institution that paid fines for its role in helping to cause a financial crisis, that wiped out communities. We're talking about obliterated certain communities. When you have someone like that who then turns around and says, we gotta save Detroit, what's so amazing is this kind of two-step that this plutocratic group has been able to pull off. You first create conditions in which people in a city like Detroit are shattered by your speculation decisions. And then you have the gall to market yourself to those folks as their Christ.
We were here in the darkest moments for everybody at all time. We didn't run, we didn't hide, and we figured, if we can help in Detroit, you can help anywhere.
We participate in this game that allows the very people abetting harm to our society or actively harming our society to reinvent themselves as saviors.
But that's part of a larger game corporations now play. Making feel-good promises with bright smiles, appearing to be different than what they really are. If the new corporation had a playbook, what might it look like? What would its key plays be?
I am here with Bill Gates. I'd love you to tell our readers what the heck creative capitalism is.
Can we take some of the caring and innovation power, the resources of corporations, and get them to focus more of that on the needs of the poorest?
Bill Gates put his idea of creative capitalism to work, pouring billions into investments in Africa, including a multi-million-dollar stake in a startup company called Bridge International Academies.
Good morning, class.
Good morning, teacher.
How are you?
We are fine, thank you, teacher. And how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Bridge is a flagship of creative capitalism. We serve children living in poverty. Even people who are living in poverty, they are earning cash. And they're earning cash for a reason. They're earning it to be able to spend it on things they need in their lives.
5 years ago, my co-founder Shannon and I decided that an aggressive startup company that could figure out how to profitably deliver education at a high quality could radically disrupt the status quo in education, ultimately creating what could be a billion-dollar new global education company. Private schools for the poor is a $51 billion a year market. No one's even thought about it.
In the global south, what we've seen is the emergence of chains of schools, for-profit schools, to compete against the public education system. One of the biggest players is Bridge International Academies. Venture capitalists invest in bridge schools, Pearson, the World Bank, Zuckerberg, Gates, and the list goes on. We hear of creative capitalism, but that's promoting a world where the market would dictate terms with respect to the provision of education.
We take lessons that other large global service providers use, like McDonald's or Starbucks. We build for scale, we systematize, we standardize. We call this vertically integrated platform, our academy in a box.
What is so interesting about this social business thing is, on the surface, it seems incredibly noble. They're saying money-making should not be the sole goal of a business, it should also have a social purpose. But what it is also saying is that the kinds of change that we ought to pursue are the kinds of change that kick something back to the winners.
But those interested financial reasons are good for the world. If we succeed in serving 10 million children, which I know we will, it's still only about 1% of children who need improved services in their government and community schools. So I hope we not only get there, but far transcend it, and in so doing, be a good partner for our shareholders and those who've entrusted us with their capital to try to make a big impact.
This is colonialism, pure and simple. Fundamentally, Bridge is saying, give us your education system. We will take care of it. Public education is one of the basic commitments of a democratic society. Education is not non-political, it's not apolitical. You teach a set of values when you're teaching. You cannot rely on Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, the World Bank to take over and provide the education that you should be providing yourself.
Bridge is in business when you want to utilize poor citizens of this world as a source of income. They're making money out of utilizing unqualified teachers.
We believe everyone is a teacher, and everyone could be. There are certain core skills you need to have. You've got to be able to read. It might seem like a low bar, but you have to start somewhere.
It's true. Bridge teachers know how to read, but they're required to do a little more in their classrooms because they follow scripted lesson plans read word for word from a tablet.
It's telling you all of these different ways to behave. Move away from the board, circulate in the classroom, give them one-on-one coaching.
You cannot have teachers who behave as robots. You follow a scripted curriculum that tells you walk 3 steps to the blackboard, walk around the classroom, and that's a teacher ought to be a natural teacher.
From an investment point of view, that because of a tragic failure of our existing systems, there's an incredible need for services to solve these problems. People have just kind of said, well, if hopefully the government will fix it, but fix it with what?
Government can't fix problems. It's a defining idea of the new corporation, a key play in its playbook, and it goes back nearly half a century.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
We believe that government should be severely limited in the way in which they say that they're entitled to impose their judgment on what the people want.
If you look at the real problems of poverty and denial of freedom to people in this country, almost every single one of them is a result of government action.
In the 1980s, corporations were frustrated by the limits on profits that they felt were imposed upon them by the combination of labor unions, increasing regulation, taxation, and that combination of things led to a kind of rebellion, one that wouldn't overthrow democracy in some overt way, but choke it, leash it, tone it down, and above all, replace it with markets.
Corporations formed alliances with governments they had helped elect, governments that were in fact anti-government and that happily lifted limits on corporate freedom. Profits soared, but a price was paid, and not by corporations.
What you get is this profound anti-government program to create deficits through the combination of tax cuts and military spending so as to make it impossible to use government in a positive and constructive way to deal with our social problems.
Mr. President, on behalf of the business leaders here in the room, let me particularly congratulate you for the historic tax reform passed last month, greatly reducing the tax burden of US companies providing a tremendous boost to the global economy.
I cannot wait to sign these giant tax cuts. It'll be the largest tax cuts by far in the history of our country.
JP Chase, they just announced earnings and they were incredible. Where are you? They were very substantial. Will you say thank you, Mr. President, at least?
Thank you, Mr. President may be in order. Apparently, he believes he played a strong role in JP Morgan's blowout quarter, best profit for any bank ever in history.
Corporate profits are the highest they've been in decades. Fast forward a few months, global pandemic. The rich keep getting richer, and our friends on the other side said, what do we do now? Let's do a tax cut. 36 million people unemployed. 40% of families who have a worker that makes $40,000 a year and less lose their job last month. 4 million people didn't pay their rent, and the Republican Party says, we don't have any money to help you. Are you kidding me? Where do you guys live?
And while corporations lobby for and profit from tax cuts at home, they further avoid taxes by stashing profits abroad.
The corporate elite is best positioned to use the system that we have to their advantage, and one manifestation of that is tax havens.
Every year, corporations squirrel away billions of dollars in tax havens. And when that's combined with tax cuts, guess what happens?
60 of some of America's biggest companies reportedly paid no federal income tax for 2018, despite earning billions of dollars in profits.
This is my first time at Davos, and I find it quite a bewildering experience, to be honest. I mean, 1,500 private jets have flown in here to hear Sir David Attenborough speak about, how we're wrecking the planet. And I mean, I hear people talk in the language of participation and justice and equality and transparency. But then, I mean, almost no one raises the real issue of tax avoidance, right? And of the rich just not paying their fair share. We got to be talking about taxes. Yes. That's it. Taxes, taxes, taxes. All the rest is bullshit, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Government used to have a lot of power to extract wealth in the form of taxes and then be able to use that wealth for the betterment of the society as a whole. But what's happened now is that we have given more power to corporations to control their wealth and to take it out of the tax system.
So what happens as a result of that? First of all, companies and rich people get a lot richer, not paying those taxes you might have been paying. Second thing that happens is the government has less money. The government's capacity is sort of contracted. And then social problems start to grow, in part because the government has less money. Now, with that background, rich people step onto the scene and say, oh my gosh, this is a shame. This situation we see here is a shame. We got all these social problems. And government, my gosh, the government should be solving this stuff, but it isn't. That is embarrassing. Well, I'm happy to solve these problems, but of course, when we do solve it, we're gonna do it my way. We're gonna privatize the solution.
The privatizer's blueprint, often also called starve the beast. You create a crisis of confidence.
How much money do we need to be investing right now in the United States in water infrastructure?
By 2020, 44% of all water infrastructure in the United States will be classified as poor, very poor, or beyond life.
You deny resources for quality public services.
In the 1970s, there were a lot of pools of free federal money. That has really, no pun, dried up.
And lo and behold, the answer is privatization.
What we believe is that private industry is part of the answer, which is very consistent with what the president's plan is.
American Water Works is one of the world's largest water corporations. It takes over public water systems and runs them for profit. And around the world, there are many other companies doing the same thing.
It's an absolutely terrifying notion, privatization of water. Moving in exactly the wrong direction, access to potable, clean drinking water is a fundamental human right. It's just insidious that the corporate mind could even conceive or imagine the notion of privatizing it.
Corporations have figured out that there are really big business opportunities in these public sectors, in part because they've been walled off from corporate influence in the past.
The private sector is voracious in seeking to privatize almost everything.
First, privatize government services as much as possible, and also the seizure and the commodification of the public commons, your parks, your public schools, your streets. How can we get more money out of the public commons?
The for-profit motivation is always a very bad reason for providing public services. There's a conflict of interest between whether you're going to pay off the shareholders or whether you're going to invest in the public system. Many responsibilities and obligations must be public in order to maintain equal access to the basic necessities of life. A healthy democratic society has a thriving private sector and also a thriving public sector. And as we permit the private sector to encroach upon and to literally absorb the responsibilities and obligations of a democratic society, we lose our democracy.
And the rise of big tech corporations is now accelerating this process. For example, in schools. Not only in Africa, but elsewhere too.
Corporations have decided that they should remake education by using technology. They want to have teacherless classrooms. But the teacher is the single most important and expensive part of education. In the tech industry's dream, if the teacher is removed from the equation, then you can cut costs dramatically.
These companies monopolize everything. First of all, monopolize their sector, and the next thing is to look where's left. These giant corporations are frantically searching for new sources of profit because it's drying up. They say, we need to take the education system, take the healthcare system, take the transport system, and own it, or we die.
Silicon Valley is the new Rome of our time. The Valley has become this extraordinary power center that has a huge say over what kind of media and information we have in a democracy, over, frankly, how many of our biggest problems are solved, over how election campaigns are run, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Technology is neutral, and in many ways it's great. But there's a difference between the technology and allowing a few powerful players to manipulate it for their own ends. So we've gone from this wide open world that opened up all of these possibilities for people to create things, to share information, to share ideas, and it has collapsed into these walled gardens that are controlled by a few very powerful players.
We're seeing Amazon, for example, gobbling up every kind of business in sight. They're interested in getting into pharmaceuticals, and they're making a big move into food.
They capture about half of everything that Americans spend online. And they're growing into all these different directions. They control 35% of the world's cloud computing capacity. They're building out shipping and logistics infrastructure that is scaled to take on the Postal Service and UPS. And increasingly, they are the intermediary for all of our smart devices. Alexa, their voice system, is 70% of the market. And on it goes. They're making investments in finance, in healthcare, hit movies and television shows. Amazon is increasingly setting the rules for what happens in its marketplace and pretending like that's a real market, but of course it's not. That's a direct threat to democracy, a very fundamental threat to democracy.
Though elected by no one, corporations are now starting to be treated like governments.
We're joined now live by the world's first ever tech ambassador. Can I start simply by asking you, what exactly does a tech ambassador do?
Well, we're basically trying to treat the technology and the tech companies in a way which is similar to the way we treat a bilateral relationship with countries all over the world. The value of their stocks is more or less the same as the GDP of France. And we think that that is being translated into influence over political affairs. We think it is necessary to treat them in a way which is similar to the way we treat other countries.
A lot of folks in the Valley believe that the companies they are building are kind of replacements of government. I think if we don't push back against the kind of agenda that these companies have, we're going to live in a world in which they are governing us privately through the profit motive, but governing us.
The deal that the corporations want from us is to hand everything to them, all the value to them, and we get a little bit of utility. We get usefulness. It becomes easier to study, or easier to get to work, or easier to take a health test. That is a dangerous deal, because nobody can guarantee what is going to be done with the information. We're handing our data with no checks, no balances, no control over it. I think that's going to be one of the new challenges of life in the 21st century.
I'm going to call them the super social media corporations, the entities that really run our lives right now. The scope of their reach cannot be underestimated. They know everything about us. Every single aspect of what we do, who we do it with, where we do it, what we buy, is a gold mine for aggregators. It lets them mold their policies and their products, predicting how you are going to live the rest of your life. They're trying to influence the decisions that you make from now to when you die, so that it will best serve, ultimately, the corporate bottom line.
Technology provides us such a seductive fantasy. Our smartphones, our data-driven systems, our social media platforms, they are all designed to conceal the true cost of these technologies to our society as a whole. Privacy is usually the value that we use to think through these issues. But for me, it's not about privacy, it's about control. The drive to make data profitable leads these companies to say who we are and define who we are to other people. Let me use a real-life example of a hiring algorithm. You'll do an interview, they'll analyze your video footage, and they'll say, you challenge the status quo, you are a change agent. Don't hire this person because they are more likely to cause trouble at work. As far as the algorithm is concerned, you are not a human being, you're just a collection of data points. And this is one of the dangers that we face today, because we are now saying we need to stop using human reason and we need to rely more on these kinds of algorithmic decision-making systems. We are increasingly surrendering our capacity to rely on human experience and to trust in each other. So the question that these technologies are really raising for us is, what does it mean to be human? And this kind of technology of strangers is one of the ways in which we are moving away from the genuine heritage of the Enlightenment.
We're taught that it is all about me. Narcissism, the cult of the self, the idea that consumption can somehow help us overcome our alienation, make us important.
I thought, what better way to cure the darkness than to go shopping? Help stimulate the economy.
These were all, I hesitate the word values, but these were all consciously instilled in the public. It upends traditional values of thrift, self-effacement, communitarianism, and replaces them with the values that we now define as American values, but which should properly be called corporate values.
In recent years, we've drifted, almost without realizing it, from having a market economy to becoming a market society. The difference is this: a market economy is a tool, a valuable and effective tool for organizing productive activity. But a market society is a place where almost everything is up for sale. We are so steeped in this commodification that it's hard to distinguish between being a consumer and being a citizen.
I'm not much of a believer in political citizenship. I actually believe much more in the power of the marketplace.
This is Richard Edelman, one of the world's most influential business gurus.
I think companies actually have filled a void left by government. Business is at the top rank. Government and media really are at the back end of the trust rank. These are big changes in reliability of business as potential good actor.
It's a brilliant strategy. They're going to present themselves as good actors and use that as part of their image and as part of their branding. When we see a big corporation doing something, it creates a sense of hope that maybe we can solve the climate crisis or inequality or other kinds of problems. We maybe even think of their huge power as being a plus because we know that the scale of these challenges are so big and we feel so powerless and frustrated about the ability of our government systems to actually solve them that we start to sort of put our faith in corporations. But of course, in the process of doing that, we're going further down the path that led us here.
I grew up in the 1950s, and at that time, there was a sense that our society would continually progress towards greater equality, greater opportunity, that there would continue to be social mobility for those at the bottom. The average pay for a CEO in the 1950s was 20 times that of the average worker. Today, the average pay of a CEO is 270 times that of the average worker.
In some cases, that gap is much greater. For example, Jamie Dimon makes more than 1,000 times the salary of one of his lowest paid employees.
Mr. Dimon, you're an expert on financial statements and you run a $2.6 trillion bank. I went to Monster.com and I found a job in my hometown of Irvine at JP Morgan Chase. It pays $16.50 an hour.
This is U.S. Congresswoman Katie Porter providing an example of a hypothetical employee, a single mother working as a teller at one of Jamie Dimon's banks.
She rents a one-bedroom apartment. She and her daughter sleep together in the same room. In Irvine, California, that average one-bedroom apartment is going to be $1,600. She spends $100.
Congresswoman Porter itemized typical monthly expenses and showed they greatly exceed the employee's salary.
My question for you, Mr. Dimon, is how should she manage this budget shortfall while she's working full-time at your bank?
I don't know that all your numbers are accurate. That number is generally a starter job.
She is a starting employee. She has a 6-year-old child. This is her first job.
And you can get those jobs out of high school, and she may have my job one day.
But the widening gap between CEOs and their employees is just one symptom of rising inequality more generally.
Right now in the United States, the richest country on the planet, half of American families couldn't pay a $400 bill that landed on their doorstep without going into debt or selling something. That's because corporate executives and corporate lobbyists are constantly able to change the rules of the game in the favor of the people who are already wealthy and powerful, making it harder to form a union, making it easier for mega corporations to shut out competition from smaller businesses, slashing the taxes on wealthy people and corporations and shifting more of the responsibility on working class people.
The result is economic inequality. It's a real moral outrage, and it can't be dealt with separate from race and gender. You can't really deal with these inequalities separately because they're all so interwoven.
The black and brown people who are impacted by police brutality, women who are impacted by sexual harassment in the workplace, the enormous numbers of workers who are struggling with poverty and homelessness, and all the degeneration that we see under capitalism for no fault of theirs. We're talking about a global economy that, for all the wealth that was generated last year, $1 trillion of that new wealth went to just 500 individuals.
I know you have a lot
I'd love to call her up and have a conversation about her financial affairs and see if we can be helpful.
See if you can find a way for her to live on less than the minimum that I've described.
Just be helpful.
The 1% and 0.01% is a group of folks who talk an extraordinary game and also act an extraordinary game of trying to help out in an age of inequality, and who are willing to do absolutely anything to help, except stepping off the backs of the working people of this country who have been screwed and passed over by 4 decades worth of change.
There's a great quote that was attributed to Justice Brandeis that said, you can have democracy or you can have large accumulations of wealth, but you can't have both. That wealth gives them a tremendous amount of power, both in promoting our political leaders, in promoting a legislative agenda, in every aspect of our society.
If I want to run a campaign that is entirely funded by corporate political action committees, is there anything that legally prevents me from doing that?
No.
So now I'm elected, now I'm in, I've got the power to draft, lobby, and shape the laws that govern the United States of America. Are there any limits on the laws that I can write or influence?
There's no limit.
So there's none. So I can be totally funded by Big Pharma, come in, write Big Pharma laws, and there's no limits to that whatsoever.
That's right.
Is there anything preventing me from holding stocks, say, in an oil or gas company, and then writing laws to deregulate that industry and potentially cause the stock value to soar and accrue a lot of money in that time?
You could do that. Yes.
Okay, great.
I think we've seen the disappearance of independent governments with the rise of corporate rule. We have seen more and more takeover of government, takeover of electoral processes.
The problem is a corporate system and a political system where governments see their main role as facilitating private corporations to basically do whatever the hell. Nothing more starkly illustrates this than our federal treasurer picking up a lump of coal and carrying it around Parliament House.
Mr. Speaker, this is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows the rule on crops.
It's coal. Mr. Speaker, those opposite have an ideological, pathological fear of coal. Affordable energy is what Australian businesses need to remain competitive.
This is Scott Morrison. He later became Prime Minister. He heads a group of high-level politicians with deep ties to major coal companies. Take note of this one, Adani. We'll return to it later. What's happening in Australia is just one part of a larger global story.
It's become accepted that corporations are in charge. Governments are incredibly subservient to corporate rule.
In the United States, we've seen under the Trump administration the wholesale corporate takeover of government on a scale with no historic precedent. It's beyond the wildest dreams of the corporate sector, especially in the area of deregulation.
I pledged to eliminate 2 unnecessary regulations for every 1 new regulation. We have succeeded beyond our highest expectations. Instead of 2 for 1, we have cut 22 burdensome regulations for every 1 new rule.
I'm willing to bet that those are made-up numbers. But the issue in regulation or deregulation is not the number. I mean, that's really absurd. What you want to know is, do you want to have another financial crisis? Well, if you do, let's get rid of the financial regulations.
Corporations have said repeatedly, we are responsible now. We understand the public interest, so we don't have to be regulated. We can self-regulate.
Well, they've got an obvious self-interest in saying that. The reason they can't self-regulate is that that's not what they're about. They're about trying to make profit. Routinely, when government regulation fails, companies in the pursuit of profit endanger people. And that's not a hypothetical. It means people get poisoned. They get diseases. They get sick. Corners will be cut, and people will be injured, and people will be killed. We see it over and over again.
Every industry has fought regulation. They all resist oversight by the government because regulation increases their cost of operating. But I've never seen an industry that's fought it more than the oil and gas industry.
Remember this? This too was a consequence of deregulation. As a result of the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe, nearly 200 million gallons of crude oil spilled into the Gulf of Mexico, making it one of the worst environmental and deregulation disasters in history. But deregulation wasn't the only problem. BP was also recklessly breaking the law. And they're not alone in being corporate lawbreakers.
Corporations will certainly do things that are wrong, that are unethical, if they're legal and permissible. And all the empirical evidence says that they will also violate the law routinely, either intentionally or because they'll just go over the lines if there's profits to be made.
This opioid crisis is a killer, and it's a killer that does not discriminate.
Lives are being destroyed as corporations profit from their playbook moves, as they play to win.
These corporate forces have no limits, and these forces have put the very human species itself at risk.
giant ecocidal corporations, they're literally playing casino with life on the earth. Their logic of profits, their process of profits, is the death of nature.
Whenever you mess with nature, you don't know for sure what the exact impact will be.
We chop down forests, we bring livestock into new regions, and we spread these new diseases. We're at the source of this problem.
Major cities all around the world are vulnerable to a disease arriving in the city and then causing a major epidemic. And again, we're seeing that more and more.
The rate at which new disease epidemics are originating, many of them moving from forests and wild species to humans, is partly because of corporate invasions into ecosystems and violence to animals. The attack on other species is bouncing back as an attack on us.
All of Italy is now effectively a red zone.
Warnings from Sao Paulo are dire.
In the United States, disaster has been declared in all 50 states.
When the coronavirus hit in the spring of 2020, it laid bare the unjust and dangerous fault lines of corporate capitalism.
African Americans have been hit hardest by the virus. Despite accounting for 14% of Michigan's population, they represent 41% of its COVID victims.
On praying, that is not. I haven't been in contact with nobody that has.
We got a possible COVID 52-year-old male, 10 minutes out, HFD.
I'll be honest with you, I can barely keep track.
This is the culmination of decades of tilting policy, tilting public resources in favor of the biggest corporations. Fewer hospitals, fewer hospital beds, less capacity to be able to respond in an emergency like this. Other systems are also breaking down right now. Essential workers, people who are on the front lines of getting our groceries to us, are really putting their lives on the line without any kind of real backing from the companies that employ them. This is partly the product of the absence of labor protections, unions, and so on. What we're seeing is a continuation of the ways that corporations have undermined ordinary people's ability to have any say over their lives.
This is actually not a crisis full of novelties. It's a crisis full of revelation. For example, the same exact dynamic of the 2008 financial crisis bailout, where the most powerful gained power as a net result of those bailouts, that is literally happening again, maybe worse.
As ordinary people suffered the despair and harsh effects of economic breakdown, giant corporations were thrown a lifeline.
Well, Madam President, I have an update. At last, we have a deal.
What did the Senate majority fight for? One of the largest corporate bailouts with as few strings as possible in American history. Shameful. The greed of that fight is wrong for crumbs, for our families. And the option that we have is to either let them suffer with nothing or to allow this greed and billions of dollars, which will be leveraged into trillions of dollars, to contribute to the largest income inequality gap in our future.
Once again, the very wealthy, big corporations did extraordinarily well. Over the last year and a half, they've spent over $1 trillion buying back their shares of stock to artificially boost their share prices so that the top executives and major investors would benefit. They could have used that $1 trillion as a cushion against the big rainy day, the storm that we now have. They didn't. Instead, they got bailed out. It's socialism for the rich, corporate socialism, but also the harshest form of capitalism for most working people and the poor.
The crisis has highlighted that we're absolutely unprepared to deal with disasters like what we're facing right now. And we also have this other, even bigger looming crisis, which is the climate catastrophe. That's not going anywhere.
It's no exaggeration to say that the greed economy is killing us. It's killing off species. It's depleting our natural resources. It's poisoning our people. A handful of corporations are allowed to put next quarter's profits ahead of the next generation. When our children and grandchildren look back in the history books and ask the question, why didn't we stop the crisis of climate change? The only answer we'll have for them is that it was profitable for a handful of corporations to keep polluting our planet.
The changes that we fear are coming faster than anybody thought. The impacts from them are going to be far worse than we thought. It's also going to change the entire global dynamic around equality. The world is going to divide in ways that we have a difficult time imagining now. We're headed for a world that sees a protected, privileged few surrounded by an immensely impoverished majority of the global population.
With the impacts of climate change now in plain view, fossil fuel companies have stopped actively denying that it's happening.
They've discovered that a better strategy for them now in the age of active climate breakdown is to charm us all into believing that they're part of the solution. Saying, okay, we're going to invest in renewables, but meanwhile, we have to keep using fossil fuels for a long time. So, we can use lighter fuels like natural gas, but we have to be realistic.
It is impossible to displace carbon fully for a very long time. Gas is a very good carbon fuel.
You have to see this as one more arrow in the large quiver of delay tactics and ways to preserve what's really the core of their business, not the core of the best interest of society. We need to transition to the cleanest form of carbon-free energy as quickly as possible. If we were to do this by tomorrow, it wouldn't be fast enough.
I mean, we'd just be stupid if we look to the coal and gas and oil industry for a clean energy future. That's not what they do. They have a business model. They're going to pursue that business model to the end of time. And they may do that if we're not able to control them.
The fossil fuel industry actually doesn't plan to stop increasing production and increasing extraction anytime soon. In fact, they're doubling down on it. Their goal is to extract as much as possible before it becomes just completely unviable for them to do so.
The fossil fuel industry is ramping up new mega projects. Some companies are pursuing profits from even the dirtiest fuels, like Adani.
Around 2011, there were plans for 9 new coal export ports up and down the Great Barrier Reef coast. Adani's proposed Carmichael mine would be a 60 million tonne a year thermal coal mine in the middle of the Galilee Basin.
It's the largest new proposed coal project in the world, to be 40 kilometres by 13 kilometres, entirely encompassed within Wangan-Jagalingou country.
It is on the doorstep of the Great Barrier Reef, an already very stressed and vulnerable ecosystem. And what we're going to see is 500 more coal ships every year trudging through a stressed reef that what scientists are telling us is already half dead.
The Adani Carmichael mine would drive global warming. It would destroy habitat for endangered species. It would destroy groundwater, and it would disenfranchise Wangan and Jagalingou traditional owners of that country.
Wangan and Jagalingou, we're a problem for Adani. So they got to do whatever they can to try and get rid of that problem. We know that the mechanisms of the state line up to work for mining companies and corporations, essentially to roll over Aboriginal people, to get past us.
The government and the state and the corporations devise ways saying, oh, we want to put this mine in, we just want to do it, we just want to put this pipeline in, and oh, these people are in our way, we need to remove them. They use security, they use our own Aboriginal police against us, they use every means they can.
To Indigenous people, it is clearly a life and death struggle. That's what you're witnessing happening around the world, this destructive corporate agenda that is completely out of control.
When a society begins to understand that that good job that they had or their parents had is never coming back, that they are going to be working 70 hours a week and still be consumed by crippling debt peonage, that all of their dreams that Oprah and everyone else has told them can come to fruition are never going to arrive. And they scream for vengeance and moral renewal, and they look for the internal enemies that have thwarted the possibility of their own aggrandizement. So then you turn on the vulnerable. You turn on Muslims, undocumented workers, homosexuals, feminists, intellectuals, liberals. All of those forces that you are told have thwarted the possibilities that were your right to have.
What you see is a frustration that grew out of economic disempowerment, turning into a new wave of hate.
There's no question that a lot of people around the world have a feeling that we've lived in this age that is incredibly abundant in innovation, but short on progress, if progress means most people's lives getting better.
I'm right-wing and I'm proud of it!
It's only a matter of time before people want to shatter the system. There's no guarantee when people rise up to shatter a system, whether you get Medicare for all or a wall on the southern border.
It's akin to the fascist movements of the 1920s and 30s, where the alienated can feel a sense of empowerment by identifying with the great leader, often in these big rallies.
There's a group out there, just throw them the hell out.
I mean, it really is like snapshots out of the 1930s, this kind of politics of hatred and reaction and division.
Fuck Islam! Fuck them!
Donald Trump wasn't the problem. Donald Trump was the symptom of the problem. The problem is a breakdown in the social cohesion that makes democracy and civil society possible. And that breakdown in social cohesion in turn was created by 40 years of rising economic inequality, by the evisceration of the middle class. Collectively, the nation lashed out by electing the candidate who was lashing out too.
This angry right-wing eruption completely agreed with the free market fundamentalism of this new order and represented themselves as a people whose whiteness, whose traditional values, whose Christianity, whose nativism should be at the heart of the country's concerns.
Let them call you racist.
Laissez-vous appeler raciste.
Let them call you xenophobes.
Mais laissez-les vous appeler xénophobes.
Let them call you nativist.
Laissez-vous les appeler nativistes.
Wear it as a badge of honor, because every day we get stronger and they get weaker.
Parts of the population are actually leaning towards strongmen. Donald Trump,
a large part of the Turkish population is supporting Erdogan, or we're seeing it in Hungary with Orban.
We are proud to stand together with the United States on fighting against illegal migration, on terrorism, and to protect and help the Christian communities all around the world.
All of these right-wing regimes represent a continuation of privatization, of the destruction of welfare, the undermining of labor unions, etc. Unchained by the kinds of restrictions that workers' rights posed, or that environmental protections posed, or that even structures for providing for the poor posed. So now corporations have freer reign.
Money has replaced the vote. America is dominated by a system of legalized bribery. Our three branches of government are wholly captive to corporate power. So you have corporate forces that purport to pay fealty to electoral politics, the Constitution, the iconography and language of American patriotism, and yet internally have rendered the citizen impotent. I don't think that you can honestly grasp the forces we're up against, including the unraveling of the ecosystem, and not be filled with despair. The greatest existential crisis of our time is to at once understand the reality before us and then find the capacity to resist.
So much of our lives is about the stories we tell ourselves. And corporations have done a very effective job at defining the limits of possibility and defining what we can expect out of life. So if we believe that we are in a dog-eat-dog world and this patriarchal machismo view of reality, then that constrains how we act and how we behave. Social movements are created out of a contagious mood and a new tactic. Part of what that new tactic does is it wakes people up, and part of what that mood does is gets them to dream again.
In 2011, mass movements for change swept across the globe in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis.
There was a cycle of struggles, sometimes called the movement of squares, that starts in Tunisia and passes to Egypt, passing then across the Mediterranean to Spain, to Greece, before it finally arrives at Zuccotti Park in the United States. And what were these movements about? They were really about the demand for a new kind of democracy.
During Occupy Wall Street, we suddenly thought, what? We can have a democracy in this country that's not run by corporate finance capitalism? Like, it's amazing, you know? And the moment was so ripe that within 24 hours, activists in New York City took up the idea and ran with it. These movements were a kind of refusal of corporate culture, consumerism, and that was their essence.
The Occupy movement quickly spread from Zuccotti Park to cities across the United States and then the world.
The Occupy movement captured the feeling that ordinary working people had, that when the recession happened in 2008, the very banks that had caused the financial collapse were the ones being rewarded, and the rest of us had got sold out.
What was so important about Occupy was to crystallize the public anger. Occupy did that and put an explanatory narrative around the 99% versus the 1%.
We're just trying to figure out a way that we can change this system. An economic system that is fundamentally misaligned in the corporate interest and against the people's interest. And that's all we're doing. Back up, back up, back up.
Occupy Wall Street was a constructive failure, but it taught us something very important. We need to pair protests with gaining sovereignty, which means either pairing protests with winning elections or pairing protests with winning wars. And you can choose as an activist. I would advocate elections.
There's only so many times you can have tear gas fired into your face and get hit over the head by a police baton or be dragged off to jail. And after a while you say, you know what, we're going to do something at the level of politics now. But all those movements face the challenge, what do you stand for? Are you actually going to challenge the power of corporations? This is what the 2020s will be about.
We turn now to Seattle, Washington, where a former Occupy Wall Street activist is being sworn in today to the city council.
We have shown that it's possible to succeed as an independent, grassroots, openly socialist campaign, not taking any money from big business. This moment belongs to that way of organizing.
Sharma becomes the first socialist elected to the Seattle City Council since the early 20th century. Her signature issue was $15 an hour minimum wage.
There were courageous workers of McDonald's and other fast food outlets who went out on a one-day strike. 15 and a union was their slogan.
On the 15th of May, 2014, thousands of fast food workers flooded the streets of 150 U.S. cities, striking to demand a $15 minimum wage, better working conditions, and the right to form a union.
We organized ordinary people, workers, rank-and-file union members, and activists who wanted to fight for 15. If you are actually going to be true to the movement, if you're going to be accountable to all these people you claim to represent, once you're elected, it does require you to take a bold and strong stance against the corporate politicians. If they're not on your side, then you have to fight against them. You're duty-bound. Of the over $1 billion of taxes that Amazon owes to the IRS, they now get a break of $789 million.
Her campaign wins so many supporters that Seattle becomes the first major city in America to adopt $15 an hour minimum wage. And that starts the ball rolling as more and more cities across the nation have followed the example of Seattle.
If you empower workers by giving them a better standard of living, it's not going to stop there. It raises their sight, the confidence of working people towards a different kind of society. You don't need a PhD in economics to know that your life sucks under capitalism, and we've got to build a movement to fight for it.
In 2019, Sharma Sawant was elected to a third term on Seattle City Council, despite Amazon spending $1.5 million to try to unseat her.
Sharma was pioneering the new urban renaissance. Starting around 2013 and 14 especially, a whole new movement developed of grassroots organizations from various movements that then united to elect for the first time representatives of their perspectives into office. You had a whole wave of people, all of whom were not expected to have a chance. All of them running on more or less the same platform, that income inequality is the moral issue of our time. And they were not just part of a U.S. movement, but you had Siddiq Khan, the first Muslim elected to the mayoralty of London. You had Anne Hidalgo, a leading environmentalist and socialist of Europe, winning the mayoralty of Paris. Carmen Yulín Cruz, the mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico. And you had Ada Colau in Barcelona. In the wake of the mortgage meltdown worldwide, there were thousands of Spanish homeowners being evicted from their houses by international banks. And Ada Colau begins to lead a resistance movement of the homeowners.
Fue una lucha muy dura, muy militante, a pie de calle, para parar los desalojos y para forzar a los bancos a negociar con las familias para que pudieran conservar su vivienda o, como mínimo, para que no se quedaran con una deuda de por vida.
¿Por qué hacen esto si no somos delincuentes? ¡Esta es nuestra casa!
Through mass protests and civil disobedience, she gains a name for herself as a defender of the homeowners.
La plataforma de afectados por la hipoteca ha conseguido paralizar el desahucio de una familia que se iba a ejecutar esta mañana.
¡Aquí no pasa ningún! ¡No pasa ningún! ¡No pasa ningún!
Fins que no tinguem aquí el president de l'entitat, que entenem que ell sí que tindrà capacitat de decisió, nosaltres no marxem. Con unas administraciones secuestradas por los intereses financieros, los bancos o de las grandes corporaciones, fuimos muchos los que nos preguntamos, bueno, pues quizás hay que dar el paso para intentar ir a la institución a recuperar lo que es nuestro. Pues mucha gente nos planteamos si no había llegado el momento de intentar hacer una candidatura política para hacer que la política sea otra cosa mucho más democrática de lo que ha sido hasta ahora. Aquí som. Gracias. Llegó a ser la primera mujer alcaldesa de la ciudad de Barcelona. Llegáramos al gobierno de la ciudad, todos los poderes fácticos nos vieron como unos intrusos, que no teníamos en nuestra agenda los teléfonos de nadie, absolutamente nadie, de los habituales, de los poderes económicos de la ciudad.
What's different about this movement is that the progressives have seen the necessity to actually capture office. Then also, once they get into office, they've understood the necessity for continuing to be connected to the grassroots movements that got them there.
Barcelona está liderando la lucha contra los desahucios respecto a cualquier otra institución que haya en todo el Estado español. Somos la ciudad que más inversión social hace de todo el Estado.
In 2019, more than 200 leading thinkers and activists endorsed Colau's bid for re-election. Barcelona has become a beacon of hope, they wrote, proving that we don't have to be afraid of standing up to corporate power, that there is another way of doing politics that puts people at the center. Colau was re-elected mayor in June 2019.
Seeing the documentary The Corporation, it opened my eyes.
This is Chris Barrett. He appeared in our first film, featured as one of the first corporate-sponsored college students.
We saw Tiger Woods on TV with a hat with a Nike logo on it, and we figured, he probably gets like millions of dollars just to wear the hat on the press conference. And therefore, we figured we can do that for someone else and hopefully get money in turn so we can go to school.
You guys were poking fun at us, but we were 18-year-old kids. Seeing The Corporation, my mind just kind of exploded. It was just like, I had never been exposed to this mindset before. I was having lunch with my grandfather, and I asked him who should the Democratic nominee be, and he told me at the time that Bernie Sanders looks pretty good. I went home and I researched Bernie's platform, and I realized that internally, I align with a lot that Bernie says.
This great nation and its government belong to all of the people and not to a handful of billionaires.
When I got connected to Grassroots for Sanders, they offered me the position of assistant fundraising manager, where I could be able to do the fundraising asks on Reddit. We were able to raise over $10 million directly to Bernie Sanders' campaign. At some of the field offices, people would come through the door and they would say, "How do I get involved? I have never voted in my life." One of Bernie's messages after he lost his presidential run was that local people could take back the power and we could run for office. I met a local political organizer in my town of Collingswood. He was putting together a slate of progressive candidates. I thought that was a brilliant idea. It was exactly what Bernie wanted us to do, and I signed the form and we were running for office. I don't think when I was out there getting a corporate sponsor that I realized that in 16 years I would be an elected official in New Jersey. I'm gonna stay on this path and I'm gonna continue down this political route until we have the progressive party of the future.
Historically, progressive movements were more interested
about building power in the streets, which is an important thing, and they kind of neglected running for office. I think now progressives are starting to see the nature of power, where it lies, and the reason to contest for it. Now we have thousands of people saying, hey, I want to run for office.
It's common to say now that the Sanders campaign failed. I think that's a mistake. I think it was an extraordinary success, completely shifted the arena of debate and discussion. Issues that were unthinkable a couple of years ago are now right in the middle of attention.
The Sanders campaign took to the larger political stage the kind of politics being practiced by local politicians like Sawant, Colau, and Barrett. Electoral politics interwoven with grassroots activism.
Some form of Green New Deal is essential for the survival of humanity. Now it's part of the general agenda. Why? Activist engagement. Young people, they receive support from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other young legislators who came into office as part of the Sanders-inspired popular wave.
I think the next wave of revolutions really is going to be this kind of strange thing where we wake up and we're like, oh my gosh, there's this social movement. They're in the streets, but they're running election campaigns. They have candidates and they're winning.
Whatever form it takes, change always begins with organizing.
2018 is going to be the year that we take the toxic, stultified politics of climate change and turn it on its head, and it starts with stopping Adani.
Our aim is to move the world away from fossil fuels as fast as possible.
The Wangan and Jagalingou people have a different struggle, which is to protect their land and to win land rights.
Adani has tried to rip our people apart. It's actually brought our people together as well. And we've been able to think about what is our alternative future? What do we want to build? And it's not extractive industries that governments and other corporations would like it to be.
What we've set out to do is support a whole range of organisations and individuals to work together to achieve much bigger change than any one organisation could achieve working alone.
We want to lose control of as many people as possible, headed in the right direction.
We figured that the only way we could really stop the project is stopping them getting financed.
Yes, they need the permits and the approvals, but Adani also needs money.
Both Stop Adani and the Wangan and Jagalingou people pushed to halt funding of the Adani coal mine.
We met with some of the largest banks in the world and said, you need to acknowledge that any investment in the Adani Carmichael coal mine will be a breach of your obligations to us as the Indigenous people who've said no. Within a month, Standard Chartered came out publicly and said that they would not be giving any money to Adani. That was after they'd already given them $680 million.
The two campaigns together succeeded in stopping funding from all banks worldwide. Then they won again, blocking the Australian government's attempt to fill the gap with a $1 billion loan.
It was a huge victory for us because we were told it was something that couldn't be done.
Adani and his government allies continue their push for the mine to go forward. And yet, not a single lump of coal has been mined to date. The resistance continues.
All of my life, I have been told who I am through stories about the people that I come from. Without their resistance and their resilience, I would not be here. It's come down to me, and I refuse to be the broken link in the chain.
The fight over the Adani coal mine has become a symbol whether corporations can continue to ride roughshod over the wishes of the community and create a future that is in their financial interests alone, or whether the community actually can build enough power to say, no, that is not the future we want. We want a safe future with a safe climate for everybody. There is this global network. There's a big fight brewing in Argentina against fracking corporations, against coal expansion in South Africa and the Philippines, in India and Poland. There's campaigns against pipelines in Canada, Kinder Morgan, Keystone XL, the fight at Standing Rock.
Our Indigenous people have been on the front lines way before my time. It's about the land, the water, our inherent jurisdiction as caretakers of Mother Earth.
But it's not just an Indigenous struggle. It's a struggle of humanity. We need to come together to push back the corporate agenda. All people, all races are beginning to realize we're in this together.
We will rise! We will rise!
You cannot unring a bell.
Our civilization is being sacrificed for the opportunity of a very small number of people to continue making enormous amounts of money. We have not come here to beg world leaders to care. You have ignored us in the past and you will ignore us again. We have run out of excuses and we are running out of time. We have come here to let you know that change is coming, whether you like it or not. The real power belongs to the people.
If we're really wanting to address the deep problems of social, racial, and gender injustice in our society, then we need to think of lessons from history.
One thing that's remarkable is just that people keep struggling. That in the worst situations, people always fight. Even when you thought nothing was possible, you look at the political situation, think how bad it is, then something beautiful and inspiring comes up.
In the spring of 2020, the world shut down, but people's hearts opened wide.
One of the most beautiful things I've seen during the crisis is the way workers in a variety of sectors have refused to go along with putting workers in danger. Amazon workers striking, FedEx workers walking out, but also healthcare workers put in dangerous situations. This foresees the kinds of struggles that will emerge from this crisis that confront the inequalities of this economy.
The pandemic has revealed that there is broad support for the idea that we need to contain corporate power so that we live in a society where we reinvigorate democracy, where we have a sense of the public purpose, and that we're not simply at the mercy of a few corporations that increasingly run our lives.
This can change the way people think about the system. We owe one another certain things, certain minimum things. That's been lost in the last 40 years of deregulation and privatization and the corporate takeover of our political culture and our political system.
It's starting to dawn on society as a whole that we're not going to go back to the old normal. There is no such world because the pandemic has revealed that the system is incapable of addressing even the most basic needs of our society.
Then, as this film was being finished, George Floyd is brutally killed by police. A flashpoint that ignites an uprising.
Thousands took to the streets demanding justice for George Floyd.
The death of a black man pleading that he can't breathe as a white officer was kneeling on his neck.
Justice now!
Imagine
how angry, desperate you would have to be to come out and protest in the historical pandemic that has had a disproportionately horrendous impact in Black communities.
Take your knee off our neck! Take your knee off our neck!
The democracy is trying to breathe because of the weight of poverty on our neck and the denial of health care on our neck. Because what's happening is, metaphorically, the whole culture is saying, we can't breathe.
Despite sometimes brutal police repression, the protests grew and began to target broader injustices and distorted priorities.
Look at the gear and the equipment that they have compared to hospital workers dressing themselves in garbage bags, being forced to use the same N95 masks for weeks at a time.
The protests quickly became about more than racist policing, confronting the echoes of corporate capitalism's racist past.
Capitalism is racial capitalism. The Industrial Revolution, which pivoted around the production of capital, was enabled by slave labor in the U.S.
There are calls to rethink who we choose to honor from our past. Monuments to men who were once honored, now viewed by a new generation as symbols of racism and colonialism.
People are protesting because they know it doesn't have to be like this. People only protest what they believe can be changed. If folk didn't protest, that meant we really would be in trouble.
I don't believe these are just protests against police brutality. We're seeing the convergence of a class rebellion with racism at the center of it.
I believe, without a doubt, that change will come from this protest. It is not just Black people.
We can't be the same coming out of this. Too many people are suffering. We must make our political system respond. We must do it in our deepest moral and I believe traditions, but it must not be weak. It has to be strong. It has to last for an election and beyond an election.
There is a whole new spirit out there that's saying 500 years of colonialism is enough, 200 years of corporate rule is enough, 200 years of the building of a fossil fuel age is enough.
I see people who are waking up to the realization that no, you don't go start an app if you want to change the world. You actually try to change the world and de-rig a rigged system. And in a moment like this, if you're not working at that level on those kinds of things, you have to really ask yourself, what was your role in this moment in history?
We've been here before. We've been at a place where my ancestors were bought and sold for profit. We've been at a place where people routinely died on the job. And over time, movements of ordinary people have broken the chains and have held corporations and powerful people accountable and changed the rules so that more people can flourish and feel truly free. I think we are in the midst of another one of those movements right now, where a lot of people all across the world are saying, enough is enough.